Thanks for your time today, Bernard. So where do you see the population growth spots at the moment, and what does that mean for investment properties?
The population hotspots are really limited to the major capital cities on the eastern seaboard, Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, as well as Perth. There are some regional centres that are doing quite well, particularly around mining communities, but the major centres of population in this country will remain the focus of population growth on a grand scale for another decade.
Well, we've seen recently that Sydney prices seem to be stabilising. So what's happening with the population there, and what does that mean for investors in Sydney?
Sydney has been through the mill, I think, over the last decade. It's almost as if the Olympics was the honeymoon, but in the years following that, Sydney struggled. And the numbers of people added to the metropolitan area slowed quite significantly. In 2001, Sydney was adding something like 65,000 people. By the middle of the decade, it was barely adding 30,000 people per year. You can't reduce the rate of growth in a city like that to that extent and not have an impact on the demand for property. You don't get the price tension you need for property growth, property value growth. But Sydney does seem to be recovering. The fundamentals are very strong in Sydney. Corporate Australia is headquartered in Sydney. Some of our largest institutions are headquartered in Sydney. International airlinks are strongest through Sydney. What this means is that the fundamentals in Sydney are very sound, very strong, and ultimately, the value of property will reflect that. This is a global city that will reflect the ability of a global workforce to compete up residential property values.
And what about the mining boom towns around Australia? Where are the population growth spots there, and where should investors be looking?
Well, the mining towns, of course, are where the action is in Australia at the moment, and some of the most the quintessential mining communities in Australia at the moment are places like Moranbah in the council area of Isaac, inland from Mackay in the Bowen Basin. A little further to the south in the Surat Basin, places like Roma, for example. In South Australia, places like Roxby Downs and Olympic Dam, and in the west, of course, the whole of the Pilbara, Karratha. These are the places that are at the coalface, if you like, in terms of where the mining intensity and demand for housing is greatest. Now, I think you need to do your due diligence if you're going to invest in these communities. Yes, there are a lot of people competing for housing in these communities, but you need to be satisfied that there is longevity to that town, that the mining contracts with China or whoever is not just going to fall over the next 2 or 3 years or so. So once you get comfortable with the longevity likelihood of mining activity in that town, then yes, certainly. But if you're not comfortable, then this is not a space that you should be in.
So any other advice?
Well, the other thing I think with mining towns is that it's not so much the mining town itself. That might be a little risky for some people. If China turns off the tap, then the demand for housing in Moranbah or in Roma, for example, or Karratha falls over overnight. It's not so much the mining towns, but the lifestyle towns associated with the mining communities. So in Moranbah, for example, I wouldn't be so much looking at Moranbah. I'm a little risk averse for that. But I would be looking at, say, the northern beaches of Mackay, where miners drive in, drive out. So the wealth created by miners in these mining communities, where are they actually spending it? And there you have towns and coastal areas of greater critical mass. The northern beaches of Mackay being a good example, and that coast right south through, say, the Yeppoon coast and down to Gladstone, even down to Bundaberg, the coast there, I think would all do well as a consequence of miners putting their families or investing in lifestyle property on the coast.